Why are some addictions glorified while others are stigmatized? And is there such a thing as a high functioning addict? What about workaholism? Is that actually an addiction? And how about trauma and other issues in childhood and adulthood that might lead someone to want to numb the pain? Learn about this and more in this interview, including an amazing transformational story. Hi, welcome everybody. Today I have the great pleasure of talking with Alex Olshonsky, who's worked for some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley, including VentureBeat, Salesforce, and a variety of other companies. He also is a startup advisor to founders and CEOs, an executive coach. And if that isn't enough, he's also a certified yoga teacher, a Hakomi somatic psychotherapy practitioner, and founder of Deep Fix, a media ecosystem dedicated to growth, exploration, and sustainable change. And what's even more amazing about Alex is that he is incredibly outspoken about mental health, in particular about addiction, since he has overcome some serious addiction himself. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Katia. When you say all that, it does sound like a lot. It's sometimes helpful for perspective to be like, oh, yeah, biting off more than you can chew sometimes, but it's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I think we share that in common because I have a lot of different trainings, and sometimes when I hear someone introduce me, it's like, whoa, I do sound like a workaholic. And that's actually something we're going to talk about: overworking, addiction to work, and so on. But before we do that, I kind of want to touch on the fact that there are two kinds of addiction, right? We have the addictions that are stigmatized and judged, and we have a lot of bias around those. And then we have addictions that are accepted and even admired. So in your case,
Mhm.
tell me a little more. How does a kid that went to Dartmouth, that worked for some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley and venture capital, end up a hardcore addict? And by that, I mean addicted to multiple substances, including opiates, alcohol, and so on.
Well, I think what's interesting is the differentiation between high functioning addiction and so-called low functioning addiction. And my thoughts on the topic have evolved quite a bit, but with high functioning addiction, an addict is often able to have a high profile life with a job, a home, family, even friends. And oftentimes they're receiving so much praise and external validation that everything seems great. And it's not until there's some sort of big painful moment that happens where the truth is revealed to themselves and others, that everything kind of comes crashing down. And so when it comes to high functioning addiction, our society essentially you can be rewarded in many ways for living a double life. And the interesting thing is that when we compare that to something that, let's say, low functioning addiction, where someone maybe is passed out on the street, shooting dope or experiencing homelessness, really the only difference between those two typically is the socioeconomic background and the privilege that that person encountered. And so for many years, I've described myself as a high functioning addict, but now I'm actually coming to a place where it's like, I wonder how useful that term is, because it's quite delusional, right? Because all addictions start in a sense as high functioning ones. And then as addictions escalate, they typically, if not dealt with, end in prison or death. And so towards the end of my line, despite many years when I was working at Twitter and building that company, and I'm a big social media empire. And by the way, don't even get me started on the irony of someone who was addicted to drugs, not who didn't realize it's helping scale the revenue of a product that we didn't realize was addictive itself. Um, it towards the end of my rope, I certainly was not functioning, and I experienced many hardships. And
You make this really important point about high versus low functioning, because already inherently there is a judgment in that, right? And when we think about
Yeah,
destigmatizing mental health, including addiction, we're now ranking, right? And because it looks
exactly.
better, or because somebody has privilege or money that covers it up a little bit, right? Now there's a judgment that somehow perhaps they're a better addict.
Yeah, yeah, precisely. And I think that's where I've recently am coming, and I'm actually working on a longer essay explaining how my thoughts on this topic have evolved. The typically the high, quote unquote, high functioning addict, that is a story of more silent suffering, where the the pain and the trauma, it often is masked by what that person's able to contribute to their just their company, to basically to capitalism. Whereas someone on the other end of the spectrum, there it's a little bit more visible that like this person is experiencing an addiction. I can see it, they're tweaking or they're shooting up on the street, when in fact, I was doing all those same behaviors, but just in the bathrooms of a really fancy tech company's headquarters. And so I'm coming to understand that, yeah, it's important, like the way we talk about these things, and the nuance, right, is welcome. That said, I don't have a better solution for a name other than high functioning addict. Maybe it's highly dysfunctioning addict, right? Because the term is useful in the sense that it still speaks to just how delusional our collective thinking is around mental health and addiction.
Yeah, you used a word or a description that I sometimes use, silent suffering. And perhaps that is something that we can utilize, because that's one of the reasons why I became a psychotherapist, is because I had my own silent suffering of anxiety and depression, even suicidal ideation, and so on. And so, but I
Mm.
was still high functioning, right? And I think that's really when we look at mental health among professionals, whether it's addiction or anxiety or mood disorders, there is a lot of that silent suffering. People look quite good from the outside until they don't, but inside they're really suffering, or they're using drugs in the bathroom, or they're barely coping and holding it together. So I think that's really an accurate descriptor, is the silent suffering versus, yeah, you see somebody shooting up on the street, it's not exactly silent. Yeah, you can look away, but it's really right there. What role did mental health play? Was addiction sort of a way to self-medicate?
Well, it's interesting because when I was in it and I started smoking cannabis pretty much every day when I was around 16, drinking most days, and didn't really stop until I finally got sober for, a decade later or so. And when I started doing harder drugs when I was working in technology, I I self-justified all of that under the guise as, oh, I was biohacking my performance. Like these things, whether it was the perfect mix of Adderall and uppers and downers, I can bring yourself to a state where I was highly productive. And the work that I was doing, despite working at some really interesting companies that were paradigm shifting, was often mind numbing. And I think I see now that I wasn't called to that work in a deeper way. So in early stages, I thought that I was just trying to make my performance better, but of course, there's so much more than that, and you can always go a layer deeper as to why. And I think, in a certain sense, I was looking to escape, but then even going underneath that, I was looking for relief from pain that I was carrying from my ancestors, that came from that have a traumatized Holocaust lineage, pain that I carried as a young boy, um, so much. And I was looking for relief to escape just a lot of pain. And even if you go a layer below that relief, what's that is an unwillingness and an inability to love myself and to accept myself. And so each as you know, and we've had conversations, like, it just continues to deepen and evolve my understanding as what led me into my addiction. And so it's more of a constellation. I don't have an answer, but I'm getting better at threading the things that led to it.
And I think that in and of itself is really powerful to realize, okay, this is a journey that's evolving. It's not like you have the answer and you're done. It's sort of an ongoing work of healing, of recovering, of understanding what led you there. And certainly trauma, we know that plays a huge role in addiction, including generational trauma. And I always think it's important to make that point because it helps to destigmatize. Somebody feels pain, they don't know how to deal with it. We'll do whatever we can to avoid pain as human beings.
Mm, totally. And that intergenerational trauma, the trauma I had as a boy, I mean, there was some even sexual abuse from an authority figure. I hadn't connected any of those dots. And I didn't until recent years. I'm approaching 6 years of clean and free living. And it's not until recently that I started to really understand just all the ways. And so, yeah, it's definitely been a journey. I think that that's common too with addiction. At first, you really need to focus on the behavioral changes. Like I'm going to remove drugs. I'm going to start working out, taking care of my body, paying attention to what I'm eating, not eating candy and Coca-Cola, which is kind of what I think an addict might love to do, and drinking multiple coffees, more than multiple a day. And so, you focus on the behavioral, and then there's like the emotional stuff, and that can get unpacked once you've got that behavioral stuff in order.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, congratulations. 6 years is amazing. And thank you for sharing so vulnerable. I mean, that's a whole other stigma of sexual abuse, especially of boys and men, that, I know we might not have time to go into that, but thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people will really appreciate hearing about that and hearing that vulnerability and understanding that there is a reason why people turn to substances or behaviors.
Yeah, I'm. It's interesting just being able to say that and have you receive it and not feel any tension or discomfort in my body, which shows that I'm in a different place than I was even a year ago to be able to talk about it in this way.
That's really powerful. Yeah. So, what made you realize you had to stop? Yeah, I'm thinking about my own life. I got sober in my early 20s. So, I've been sober for a couple of decades. This was before I was high functioning in any way. I just hit rock bottom very early, I guess. For you, what made you realize, what was your rock bottom?
Well, I knew when I was pretty young, when I was early 20s, and when I was doing lines in the bathroom at work, I knew that, and I was waking up with withdrawal, cold, leg tremors, cold sweats. I knew that I was in a situation that was beyond me, and in a situation, bigger than a pickle. And I didn't know how I got there. I truly was confused as to how I landed in that state. And it took many, many, many passes at treatment where I attended hybrid programs half-heartedly. I really wasn't. I always thought for me, what I focused on was the opiates as being the real issue, and yet I was still using many, many other things every day. And so it took a pretty big series of events, but essentially, to put it simply and more succinctly than the complexity of how this all happened, I had lost a job, a big, pretty prestigious tech job. And then my partner had, who was my wife at the time, had asked for space in the same week. And so I was jobless, wifeless, broke, and beyond broke, and sick, really sick, in withdrawal. And so that was my moment, and where I really was, this is not working. I got to do something. I need to change.
And then you got sober, which is an incredible journey that takes a lot of courage. So I really salute you for that. One of the things you talk a lot about in your really incredible newsletter that I highly recommend subscribing to is our addiction to work and that relentless productivity, being mobilized all the time, being just feeling like I have to pursue something all the time. Tell me about that. How is that an addiction? And what happens when we stop or
Mhm.
try to stop?
Yeah. In my thoughts around workaholism and work addiction, productivity addiction are definitely evolving as well. And I noticed it most pertinently when I transitioned out of tech and now I'm just writing and coaching full time. And I noticed how my nervous system was trained from many years of balancing multiple jobs and working in Silicon Valley for 12 years. My nervous system was trained to almost really love the feeling of just pounding through emails. And it's a state of hyper arousal that I'm coming to see is actually addictive itself. And the more I study the nervous system and the way dopamine works, it's like, in fact, depending on how semantic goal you want to get about your definition of addiction, like you can in fact be addicted to work. And so um myself, like I think one thing that I'm super conscious of is now that I've transitioned out of working, in quote unquote Silicon Valley full time, I really want to be conscious of not repeating some of the same patterns that got me into trouble in the first place. And so, namely, for me, that is manifesting as my focus on building my business or writing, which has been really, you mentioned the newsletter, and that's been really exciting and it's growing and it can bring me into the same state of mind of, oh, I got to do this and I got to grow and I've got to, this very Silicon Valley mode of thinking that scale for the sake of scale is what we should be focused on rather than the more human dropping down, slowing down. So that's been something that I'm really aware of recently.
And I'm thinking this relentless pursuit of more, right? More productivity, more success, more money, more potential. You write about searching or chasing potential is, in my experience, often driven by negative beliefs. I'm not good enough. I'm not enough. I'm not doing enough. I should be more. So tell me
Yeah.
what you've learned about that and how do you personally work with those beliefs?
Yeah, such an important point where how many businesses have been built, how many careers have skyrocketed or just in so many different shapes and form because of a belief that I'm not good enough and I need to prove to someone or myself or to the world that I can do it. And I think that this is another one of those things that doesn't have a black and white answer. Yet what I do like differentiating is a state of being versus a state of doing. And if the state of being is full and I can be tapped into who I am as a person, if I can be in my body, that tends to inform a state of being, excuse me, a state of doing that contributes more beauty to the world rather than taking away. And so I really these days try to make sure that I'm not just in a doing mindset all the time, and that my being, and whether that's somatic practices or meditation or yoga, that I'm tapped into that part of myself. Because yeah, potential is an interesting mixed bag, where on the one hand we all have potential inside us in the same way that an acorn has the blueprint to become an oak tree. But then on the other hand, the way we think of potential in terms of a Western self-actualization mindset is somewhat of a disease, that whatever we're doing is not good enough and that we can escape this, grand deity of death, where at the end of the day, it doesn't care how much you've lived up to your potential.
Self-actualization, you've written beautifully about this fine line between self-actualization and self-destruction. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing about the self actualization model was that, um, Maslow's pyramid, where when we had our psychological needs and physiological needs, safety needs met at the bottom, we're supposed to move up the ladder and eventually achieve self actualization, where we're becoming our best selves. And um, that hasn't played out in reality. If we look at, particularly in the Western world, one, there's diseases of despair, which is deaths from alcoholism, suicide, and overdose, and those are higher than any other time in history. Um, as you know, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, just depression and mental illness, anxiety. That's we live in anxious times, and so it appears that why is it so many people in the West have these basic needs met, but no, we're not self-actualizing. It's more like it actually, if you look at it with, I think, some sober eyes, it seems like we are closer to self-destruction. And so interestingly, I know that Maslow later in his life, he added the eighth level, which was transcendence, which is like, okay, once you self-actualize, then you help others, which if you look at a more First Nations or indigenous model of self-actualization, it's actually on the bottom. And then every community actualization and kind of perpetual multi-generational growth are at the top of the pyramid. And so I think that it just speaks to kind of like our individualistic nature versus a more communal and multi-generational mindset. And so, self-actualization, I think, is I'm coming to learn, is kind of a dangerous concept.
Yeah, you touch on the environment, on communities, on sort of the global community, right? And our focus on self-actualization, on more, on achieving more, doing more, having more, has a cost that we're not always consciously aware of, right? So that's the other
Mhm.
side of destruction as well, that what we do can come at the expense of other communities, other countries, and certainly the environment. I think that's pretty abundantly clear at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, precisely. Um, and so I think where I'm currently at with the topic around potential is that rather than potential or even self-actualization, maybe a better word is becoming. And we're all in this state, living in this state of becoming, where we're becoming into who we are meant to be, and just exactly who we are in the moment. And so that's I think where yeah, sometimes I think I overthink about the actual words, but maybe that's the curse of being a writer. But I do think becoming is a better and more attractive word than potential or actualization.
Words do matter, right? And the framing matters because our brains categorize. So the words we use, or the categories, or the framing, the metaphors we use do actually matter and have an impact, right? And becoming, and also words like permission to slow down do, I think, make a difference. You said something when you were talking about Maslow, it made me think about something that really, the way we live our lives in modern society, our nervous systems actually act as if we're in danger all the time. In some ways, we're at the bottom of the hierarchy of needs, where safety needs come first. You talk about false urgency. Tell me a little, is there hope for us? What do we do with that?
Yeah. So false urgency is a term that I coined to describe feelings of hyperarousal, namely around attention and productivity. And so, for instance, getting a notification on your phone and feeling like, whoa, like I got to respond to that comment right now. Or for me, it can be towards the end of the day, I get a thought that like, oh, I didn't do that much today. I didn't really get as much done as I was hoping to get done. And then I get activated, and I notice my body kind of come alive. My heartbeat increases, and it's like, oh, maybe you should open your note taking tool and send out this tweet, or a million other things that, I could be doing. And so that feeling is, I think, also can be quite addictive, and it's false, because there's actually no urgency. And so to your point, I think, and this is the root of what causes many addictions, is that in our life we have all of our needs met. We can swipe for mates on apps, and we can have our food delivered by drones soon enough as we sit in our comfy chairs. And as such, we need to invent problems and meaning. And so the feeling that we would get if there was an actual saber-toothed tiger, in our midst years ago, is quite similar to the feeling that we get from a notification, feeling that we, are seeing a comment pop up that we don't like. It's actually somatically not that different. And so is there hope for us? You know, that's I think so. I think there is hope. And I think that the more yeah, and that's partial to my belief that integrated mind body somatics are the future, where, the mind got us only so far and got us very far as society. But now if we don't integrate the body and the nervous system and all that awareness, we'll keep these same patterns.
So, for those people listening who don't know what integrated mind body somatics means, tell us a little bit more what that means and what are some practical ways we can do to help with that?
I'll speak to there's probably a more professional definition, but what it means to me is that rather spending so much time in my head and focusing on my thoughts, and we could even talk about who's the author of my thoughts. I try to drop into my body and trust the feelings that my body's feeling. And so there's this idea of interoception, listening to the signals within your body. And then, but even, beyond that, from a more spiritual sense, is thinking about how much of my action and my being is coming from the heart rather than from the head. And I think of this line I heard, which is the longest journey a human will ever take is the 17 inches from their head to their heart. And for me, like somatics, of course, somatics, the soma is the body. It's broader than just the heart. But I think for me, it's knowing that, like, if I focus on the expansiveness that exists in that heart region, it tends to inform a way of being that is more beautiful and generous. And so that's what I think. But I'm curious what you would say, Katya. You probably would have a better definition than I do.
I actually love your definition because it has a lot of heart and it's not so technical. And I think that's beautiful. I mean, I would actually not say it too dissimilarly that we, maybe putting it a little more technically, we don't just pay attention to our head up here, but we pay attention to our nervous system, to our heart, perhaps even our soul, our body in particular, which we tend to be very disembodied, right? We're all in our head and it's all thinking, and our body has a lot of wisdom. That's where emotions happen. And when we can be attuned to our body, we can change because our body is going to tell us. When my heart's racing and I feel like I'm whoa, feeling like that, I know I need to stop, right? But if I'm not listening to that or overriding that, then I don't, and I push, and then that ends in burnout and using things. It doesn't have to be drugs, right? I can binge watch, I can use caffeine, whatever it might be. Yeah, Alex, I could talk with you for hours. And I know we've had many good conversations in the past. For now, I want to ask you 3 questions that I ask everyone that I interview, which are,
Sure.
what does it mean to you to befriend your emotions? Why is that important if it is? And what are your favorite tools?
So I think the solution is somewhat in the question there, where it's because the idea is befriending and welcoming what arises rather than resisting it. And I think that I don't know if I always do a great job of befriending, because sometimes I really don't like what it is that I'm feeling. And that for me, that's often anger and frustration, really self-directed. There's a great parable from Buddhism, which is that the first arrow that you get hit by is what happens, and then the second is the one that you shoot at yourself. And so I experience that second arrow often, and even hearing something like intellectually like that, where I might get frustrated at myself for something, but then I catch myself. It's like, oh, okay, dude, don't shoot 3, 4, 5 more arrows at yourself. Like, it's helpful to remember that. And something else that I do for my tool, journaling, I have a pretty elaborate journaling practice where I do a version of stream of consciousness morning pages that I handwrite. And then every morning, which is just a really good way to check in, and I try to assess how I'm feeling. And then I also have, when I shift kind of into my computer, I have a set of journaling prompts that I use. And one of them is, how am I feeling? And something that I always try to do is I just name three adjectives of how I'm feeling. And what I also do is, so, and this is something that's common. I do a fair amount of men's work, and men often have a tendency to say, I'm a little tired, or yeah, I'm feeling kind of angry, rather than I'm angry, I'm tired, I'm pissed off, right? And so removing the fillers and the all those ways in which we have to qualify what we're feeling. And so when I write in the morning, I try to just, I'm tired, I'm joyous, I'm excited. Just name it without trying to justify it with those little conjunctions. And so that's been an interesting process, but it's one too that I actually have that I found this list of um like a list of words that describe feelings, and sometimes I even reference that just so I can also expand. Okay, here are some other ways to describe the thing that I'm feeling, like elated. Pessimistic is an obvious one, but the list is helpful for me too. And so that is something that I think I'm getting better at, is understand befriending the feelings.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, and again, it goes back to words matter because they do influence us, right? If I say I'm miffed, it's a very different energy than when I say I'm livid, right? It's
Yeah.
anger, but it's a very different kind of anger. Well, Alex,
Yeah.
how can people get in touch with you? I highly recommend subscribing to the newsletter. I'm going to post a link in the description of the video, but how else can they get in touch?
Yeah, and thank you for that, Katya. So the newsletter is Deep Fix, and you'll see the link from Katya on social media. I'm at OLOAL, and that's on Twitter and Instagram. I'm probably most active on Twitter, and then my website is ontheolo.com. And so I'm happy to connect and would love for folks who are interested in any of these topics to check out the newsletter. And there's a community that we have associated with that newsletter. And so, yeah, thanks, Katya.
Thank you, Alex. This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom, and delighted that you took the time.